Welcome to This Week in Heresy, Episode 18, Polytheism and the Meaning of Words, with our guest, Lon Sarver, on location at his home in Hayward, California.
Hey, Lon, welcome to This Week in Heresy.
Glad to be here.
Well, for the people that don't know you, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Well, my name is Lon Sarver. I am a polytheist and an editor, and I have a background in psychology, and all those things work together a lot better than one might at first think.
Right.
Let's see.
Well, you're a devotee of Dionysus.
Yes. I ran into Dionysus for the first time around 1998, I think. I was working at a university library that day and reading a book on a break, and it happened to be a book about Dionysus. Just sort of, while pondering what was in what I was reading, just sort of unbidden, a imagination vision of the room I was sitting in came up, which was just like realistic, except for an image of Dionysus standing there, going, all right, what took you so long? I've been waiting.
That seems to happen a lot with most deities, at least in my experience.
I don't know. I think maybe they just like to look cool, like everything's all planned out. So they're going to put on that, oh, I've been here all this time. What took you so long kind of thing. Right. It's one of those things where the more I look back on it, the more it seems, okay, well, yes, it's obvious that should have gone that way, even though it wasn't at all obvious at the time. Of course, who knows how much of that is reshuffling in hindsight. But since then, I have had a more and more primary relationship with Dionysus as an individual entity.
Right.
I had started with reclaiming style Wicca back in at the end of the 80s. Some friends of mine and I taught ourselves generic Wicca out of a copy of Drawing Down the Moon and a copy of Spiral Dance, because that's all that was available in Eastern Iowa at the time.
Right.
And the first ritual we did was really powerful, and there was a very strong feeling of the presence of the divine, which was really cool, and it was something I had not gotten from the religion I had been raised in. My family, Southern Baptist, to begin with.
Right.
And that really got me hooked on paganism. But what I found is, as I worked more and more incorporating different deities from specific deities from mythology and different deities from different mythologies in there, that I began to get more of a feeling of them as individuals, and the feeling of the one divine all, while still there, became very much a background hum. And it has become, over the last 20 years or so, 25 years, more important to me to have that sense of individual relationship with another individual personified being. And that's really the heart of it for me.
Right.
So I have, my practice these days is less about a particular tradition, a particular set of rituals, a particular set of holidays and whatnot, and more about customizing activity to a one-on-one or one-on-two or however many relationship with the various spirits and powers and whatnot that I'm working with at any given time. Dionysus is still there on top. If you go up and look at my altar, there's two shelves. There's the one with so much Dionysus stuff on it that it's practically falling off the wall. And then there's the everybody else shelf underneath.
Right.
So it's very clear who is the one that is my main guide, my main mentor in spirit. There are others that I've become interested in through working with them, and others that have shown up to me and expressed an interest. The fairy version of Melek Taus is one that I ran into in my own fairy training. I'm not initiated in fairy, but I have been trained in it. And he stuck with me from that. On the other hand, I started hanging out and working with somebody who works a lot with Gede, Voodoo Loa of the dead. And one of the Gedes started following me around, and there were several people who had other, with no particular prompting or priming, would say, like, you got a dead guy behind you? And I'm like, yes, I know. I'm not sure which one it is yet, but there's a dead guy back there. So I've got a relationship with an entity that found me through another connection, trying to find out who specifically that particular one is, because the gedes are plural. They are the dead. They are the connection with the ancestors, and there's one for everybody, and then some extras. So finding out who that is particularly so I can build a stronger relationship with that gede is part of what's going on as well. That, and I got to admit, there's a certain amount of, wow, all the cool kids seem to be polytheists these days when I'm reading in the pagan blogosphere. Some of the most active bloggers that I've engaged with and read have been talking about how that individual relationship is important to them. And it's been really inspiring reading.
Yeah, it's been an interesting, I've read a lot of that too, and it's been really interesting because there's been a lot, it seems to me that there's been a lot more of a push to have distinct theology in paganism these days. Yeah. So like, it is the polytheist camp, and then there's the panentheist camp, and then there's the all goddess all the time camp, and it seems to be splitting into these different theologies, which I find really fascinating after being in seminary for 3 years. Right. Because, it's like paganism is finally getting to that point where it's the theology is what we're talking about instead of how do we be pagan in the world.
Well, I think part of that is that as a spiritual movement, paganism in general has gotten large enough that it's to some extent safer than it was to look at our differences.
Right.
When, especially back prior to, say, 95, prior to, say, when the web really took off and online social networking made connection with other pagans a whole lot easier.
Absolutely.
There was a very small town mentality of, we may not all agree on what we do or all feel exactly the same thing, but it's all close enough and we're the only ones we know, so we have to stick together.
Right.
And a lot of differences were either acknowledged once and never mentioned again, or simply swept under the, that's their personal practice rug, and the rest of us don't have to worry about it or know about it.
Right.
But as it has become easier, especially in large areas like the Bay Area or the Twin Cities area or any of the other big pagan populations, especially as it has gotten easier to meet each other and easier to talk to each other and easier to talk to people with whom our relationship with them does not so seriously impact our in-person communities. Because getting into an argument with somebody who lives in New Zealand over the internet is not going to alienate any of your friends right where you live. As that has become easier and easier to have disagreements and arguments and discuss diverse experiences, it has thrown more attention on the places where we are different from each other, which has called into question whether or not the big tent paganism is big enough. And whether or not we want to try to make it big enough, or whether or not we'll lose some of the personal immediacy of practice and interaction by making it too big.
Right.
What I see with the polytheists and pagans, because there are some people who will identify themselves as polytheists rather than or in addition to pagan, is about inclusion. A lot of the arguments I've read about it focus on theology a lot, about what we think about our gods.
Right.
But what it comes down to is, if you are going to put on a ritual that says everybody is welcome, this is an all-encompassing ritual, we take all kinds here, do you really? Are your invocations of deities, if you even have them in the ritual, going to be more comfortable for some and less comfortable for others? Which is perfectly fine. The world is big enough to have all kinds of religious expression and all kinds of religious practice. And it has to, because we're not the same as individuals. So naturally, there's going to be some that work one way and some that work the other way. But when it doesn't fit quite right, what do you do when somebody says, hey, you invited me to this thing saying it was one size fit all, but it's a little tight over here in the crotch. So what do we do about that? And unfortunately, what it seems we do about that is we start blaming the person who is complaining for having, harshing the mellow, or why do you want to be a disruptive influence, or can't you just pretend that all gods are one God for just this hour?
Can't we all get along?
Right. And there are some people for whom the experience of deity as the experience of the gods as distinct entities that are distinct from each other and distinct from us is so central to their religion, to their spirituality, to their understanding of how all this great whatever it is works, that they can't get into a more, we call upon the great goddess whose name is Beth and Flo and Evelyn and whatnot, all rolled up into one, because they're like, but wait, no, Beth is a Sumerian deity and Flo is, Chinese Taoist mountain spirit, and they don't actually work together.
Right.
Kind of thing.
Right.
And there's an extent to which if you can't get past that kind of analysis, you can't get into the ritual. And there's an extent to which, if you are convinced, if it is important to you to understand your deities as individuals, that is as insulting as saying, hey, Gina, you're female. That means you're just like all the other females. So if I need to talk to, Denise, I can talk to you and it will be exactly the same thing. And tomorrow I'll ask Sarah about the thing that you're doing in the morning, and I should get the same information because it's all one thing.
Right.
And no, it doesn't work that way either.
Right.
But then the question becomes which way are we going to go in the direction of inclusion? I think it's important to have an overall community. And I think just because of the way that everyone who has come through modern paganism has come from the same historical moments, the same processes that brought this as a modern religious tradition.
Right.
It's good to maintain those links, and it's good to have a larger community to draw on and to be within, just as humans, as communal beings.
Right.
So I don't want to split off too much, but we have to work out how to maintain that together without alienating each other in the process.
Well, I think maybe, at least in my opinion, in being somebody who likes to work in radical inclusion, is being honest about what's going on. You know, if you're going to have a ritual where you're saying you're welcoming everybody, saying, hey, we're going to be calling in X god, Y goddess, this, that, the other. This is the way this group focuses its spiritual work, and everybody who would want to experience that or is curious about it, you are welcome to come regardless of whatever.
Right. And failing to be that clear about what your actual practice is, I think, has been the heart of a lot of the actual experiences of feeling excluded. There is an assumption that the basic derived from generic Wicca ritual format works for everybody.
Right.
And nothing works for everybody.
Yeah.
But because so many of the books that people have learned from, and we have more pagans than we have teachers for pagans, so a lot of people are learning from books primarily.
Exactly.
Are written by people who either are Wiccans or learn from Wiccans, that there's a whole lot of basic assumptions that are native to Wicca that have gotten out and have become general pagan, for lack of a better term, which is what is meant by the term Wiccanate, which comes up a lot.
Right.
But there are theological assumptions embedded in those practice assumptions. The idea that so many rituals automatically assume that you have to have a goddess and a god, or equal numbers of goddesses and gods, comes from that Wiccan duotheism of the goddess and the god that is part of the ritual structure.
I mean, that's even around gender as well. it's assumed that if it's a women's ritual, then they're just going to be calling goddess, and that's all it is. And if it's a men's ritual, they're just going to be calling a god, a version of the god, and that's all there is. And it's the assumption that men might not, men probably aren't going to call on a goddess, and it's just like, no, that doesn't make sense to me. If a goddess is calling somebody who identifies as male, then why is that odd?
The gods are going to talk to who the gods are going to talk to. And I don't know about you, but I'm not going to tell them to stop it.
Absolutely.
I mean, I have so far been fortunate enough not to be struck by lightning or swallowed by an earthquake or anything, but, why push it?
Right.
There is a trend in public pagan practice, which is becoming increasingly different from private pagan practice. What people do in their living rooms with their 3 or 4 coven mates is increasingly different from what is put on as public ritual. I find the small groups better at welcoming people who practice differently than the large groups.
Right.
Large groups try to be as all-encompassing as possible by abstracting out as much as possible, to the point where it doesn't matter whether or not.
Well, it gets. I think I see where you're going here, because to me, in my mind, it's like you abstract out so much, you dilute it so much that there's no there. Yeah. Well, that there is no there. In an attempt to not offend anyone or not exclude anyone, it becomes completely wide open. Right.
And that's good to an extent that does allow more people to come and feel connected in some way, but it lowers the ceiling for the level of intensity that most people are going to feel.
Right.
Because most people don't attach as intensely to abstracts as they do to concretes. But further, the implications of that level of abstraction, as it has become more and more ensconced in how the community does public ritual, the implications of that are that it doesn't matter who the individual gods you're calling are. It doesn't matter whether or not there are gods. We're just going to do the thing. The focus on a harmonious communal practice has been done in a way of it has to be one size fits all. We have to have all the main rituals be something anybody can wander into off the street, which is good in the sense of it gets a larger variety of people, greater diversity, and all the benefits that come from diversity.
Right.
But it also makes it harder to have that feeling of intimate personal contact. What personally I'd like to see more of is more of devotional rituals, more of workings that are specific to a particular pantheon or a particular deity or a particular tradition that are open to visitors who aren't necessarily of that tradition or of that particular deity, but still focused on that deity. More of a, this is what we do. You can come do it with us, but we're going to do it the way we do it. So
check us out.
You can check us out so you can see whether or not it works for you. So that our God can meet people who aren't just us. You know? To have a general community with a lot of specialized groups doing their thing that they invite other people into. I think would be more valuable in the long run than an increasingly generalized, increasingly abstracted standard set that everybody does.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, because it's like, you want to respect people's identities too, because, you're a devotee of Dionysus. That is part of your identity as a pagan, as a witch. For me, it's Hecate and Jesus. And, that's, and I know I'm trying to do that with my church as well. It's like, okay, we bring in all deities, but we also have Jesus as kind of our primary focus of this. Right. Our coven's different, but we also let individual members in our coven bring in their own thing. And, we'll be there in ritual with them. And, it might not be, somebody could do a working with, I don't know, a foot god or something, and, it may not be my thing, I might not have a foot fetish or whatever, right. But, it's something to experience. And, and I'll know at the end that, it's not my thing, but I could say, hey, I had this interesting experience. And then somebody might come along and say, hey, I'm interested in this. Do you know somebody who...
Right. And now you do.
Yeah.
The experience is key, I think, because we can study religion in terms of studying its history and its ritual and the origins and significance of the symbols.
Right.
We can study it intellectually all we want, but I don't think it really becomes meaningful. I don't think it really becomes powerful in your life individually until it becomes something that you experience.
Right.
Through the medium of those stories and tools and images and whatnot. So the experience is what it's all about. That's what makes it living in your life. And I think that any theology we develop has to be based in that experience.
Right.
I wrote a blog post recently. I have a blog I call Drinking from the Cup of Life. And we can link that later probably.
Yeah, we'll put it in the show notes.
I had a blog post recently where I was talking about theology isn't like physics. It's not a search for the objective rules of the spirit world by which everyone has to live because they always work whether you like it or not. Theology is, even, just in its basic literal translation, how we talk about the gods, how we talk about our spiritual experiences.
Right.
And the further our theology gets from our experiences, the less useful it actually is for what it's supposed to be doing.
Right.
And, I think that not being a religion student, not being a theologian or a professional philosopher, but just somebody who thinks a lot.
Right.
I think that what theology is really good for is in allowing a diverse lot of people to come to the same understandings that allow them to share experiences together. And to the extent that we start making our theology divisive, we are cutting people out of being able to experience that with us. And if all you're trying to do is get your 6-person circle together and just the 6 of you forever, and you don't care about interacting with the rest of everybody else, maybe that works.
Right.
I'm not ready to walk away from the rest of everybody else yet, so I'm going to try and make that more open.
Right.
This is why I think the arguments that devolve into arguments of whose theology is better eventually start sounding like arguments over, could the Hulk beat up Superman?
Right.
Because it becomes something that is so divorced from our actual lived experience of practicing our religions and being in relation to our gods that it becomes an abstract intellectual exercise rather than a spiritual experience.
Yeah, and I think I find that too when you've got some of, and I've seen this, and I mean it's present in all religions really, but when you get to the point of somebody's like, well, this is the theology as I understand it, and this is right. And I know it's right, and this is how it's supposed to be, and you're all wrong. Yeah.
I don't know who the gods are when they're at home. I don't know how they look like to themselves or just to each other. I only know how they look like when I'm looking at them.
Right, right.
And I feel fair to certain, although I don't have objective proof to convince anybody else, but I feel fair to certain that what I see is just the tiniest fraction. It's like the bit from Exodus when Moses is on top of Sinai and Abraham's God is like, I'll show you my hymn, because if I show you anything else, it'll burn your brain out.
Right.
In fancier, more, forceful language. But basically, you can't look at all of what I am. Here's the bit that's actually safe for you to look at. And I'm pretty sure that all of them are doing that, whether they're saying so or not.
Yeah.
I know how I see Dionysus. It's not always how any other devotee of Dionysus sees him.
Right.
And the things that he says to me are going to be things that he needs to say to me because I need to hear that to be the kind of relationship with him he wants from me. And it may be entirely different than what another devotee of Dionysus hears.
And it could be also, like for me, I'm more of a panentheist where I believe there's kind of this one unknowable thing, being, entity, and that the deities that I work with are facets of that energy, that being that I can understand and relate to, and that do different things with me. Right. And I think acknowledging that people will see deity differently is really important. Because, we always see history, we see the world. I mean, I'm looking at you right now, and what I'm seeing of you and how I'm interacting with you is not the same as you interacting with me, even though we're doing something together.
Well, we're just the tip of the iceberg to each other. I've got
absolutely
40 years of life behind me, sprawled over 3 or 4 different states with thousands of people in the background. Right. And that all comes together in who I am now. But you can only see what's right here in front of you. You can't see all those tracks going back into the past.
Yeah, I mean, you can tell me about your past and your history, and I can tell you about mine.
Right.
But, we're going to have different experiences, even though we've had a lot of similar experiences.
Right. And if that's true of, such limited beings as us, it's got to be true of the gods. Or at least that's got to be an easy way to understand what's true of the gods for us mortals, because, like I said, I don't see them except through mortal eyes.
Yeah.
So it strikes me as odd that there is no room to be saying to somebody, well, your experience of the gods is wrong. Because, it's their experience. I can't experience their experience, so I don't know whether or not it would strike true for me. Right. And even if I could know that and it didn't strike true for me, it doesn't mean that it doesn't serve the purpose that the gods want for that other person.
Right.
So to the point where we are arguing whether or not your experience of the gods is wrong, or whether how you're talking about them is wrong,
or if you're mixing gods that people don't approve of,
right, that is not useful. I can see it as useful in a personal sense in terms of you describe your experience of the gods to me, and then I have to look at it and think, all right, is there something from that I should be taking into my own practice, that some way that shines a new light on my own experience?
Yeah. Or is this not my cup of tea?
Yeah, or is it not got anything to do with me at all?
Right.
That's a very personal level of judgment, but that's not an absolute objective, you're wrong. Even if I decide that what you've shared with me has absolutely nothing to do with what I'm doing and I can't use anything from it, that's just that it's not my experience and it has no bearing on my experience. It's not that you're wrong.
Right.
Something that came to me when you were talking about the one great divine whatever, and then the various facets of it, reminded me of, at this past Pantheacon, up in the, I believe, was it the Covenant of the Goddess Suite? We had a discussion of Wiccan privilege, was what it was supposed to be about.
Right. I remember reading about that afterwards.
And one of the things that kept coming up was that the discussion was terminally bogged down in debates over the meanings of terms being used.
Right.
One of the main speakers, whose Latin name I'm going to be completely butchering here. Sorry about that.
Right.
P. Suferius Virus Lupus.
Ah, yes. I know who you're talking about.
Lupus is what he usually goes by.
Right.
In this sort of thing, because it's easier than trying to remember the Latin for some people who don't actually speak Latin.
Right.
Lupus was defining polytheism as belief that the gods are many. And leaving it right there, not putting a hard polytheism or devotional polytheism or any of the other tags that have been prefixed onto polytheism to help make it more distinct from what general paganism sees as polytheism.
Right.
And the discussion derailed right there as people were arguing, but I'm a polytheist too. And we're using the word entirely differently. As somebody who, there were people there who would say, I believe in a god and a goddess. That's multiple gods, so I'm a polytheist too.
Right.
And, Lupus would respond with, well, that's not actually what I mean by the word. The word means this. It means there are many gods. It means there are a multitude of gods, and that they're all individual, they're all important, and they can't be squished together usefully. And then somebody else would argue, well, I believe that all gods are facets of the one divine thing. And that would come back to, well, okay, if you're worshiping one god through many facets, you're worshiping one god, not many gods, so that's not polytheism either. But that was not what the talk was supposed to be about. That was supposed to be a setting out of basic terms so we could understand what the talk was supposed to be about, which was about whether or not, or to what extent, the prevalence of Wiccan thought and Wiccan theology privileged some people and, disadvantaged others. We only got to talking about that on 2 or 3 points because it kept coming back down to, but I want to identify as a polytheist and I may think it believes this way, so you must be wrong if you take it another way.
Right.
I'm tending to lean towards Lupus's side on that because that is actually the definition of the term in the dictionary.
Right.
But I can see how it's been used differently for people who want to use multitudes of divine names to call on the god and the goddess.
Right.
But until we can agree on those base terms, at least for the purposes of a particular discussion, without getting all invested in and offended by someone else using them differently, we're not going to get on to the larger discussion.
Well, yeah. And, that just kind of, I think, pokes at the humanness of the discussion itself. You're dealing with a group of humans who are seeing things all differently. Right. And trying to come up with common terms and the limits of language and all of that. And it makes it difficult to talk about this because even academia, granted, there's a certain terminologies that we have, but even in academia, there's arguments about what different terminologies mean, and it's
half the word count. Half the word count, and half the academic papers I've ever read have been arguing for, well, I'm going to use this term differently, and this is why my way of using it is better. For the first 30 pages of the 50-page thesis,
Yeah, and then you have maybe 4 paragraphs about what they're talking about.
Now that I've told you how I'm going to say it, I only have enough room to sum up what I was actually going to say, but trust me on this, I'm right.
Right. Well, there's a particular theologian that I read, and this goes into a lot of the interfaith work that I've done, where each religion itself has its own language, and how, there are certain terms and definitions that are kind of that are unique to each religious group, and he also went to say that you can't have similar experiences with different groups because the language isn't the same. I differ on him with him on that because I think you can have a similar experience. You're just going to end up describing it differently.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I have not been able to articulate well enough to actually blog about it or even sound like I know what I'm talking about when I talk about it yet, hopefully I'll do better right now, is meaning. All right? Meaning isn't definition. Meaning is how we find a way to integrate. It's the meaning is the infrastructure of concepts and images that we use to weave our experiences into a coherent story of our own lives and the world we live in. And we generate meaning by having experiences and finding a way to stitch those into the rest of our experiences through association usually. This experience was like that experience, so I'm going to connect them. Right. Whether or not it was, 10 years apart and 1,000 miles apart and different things, there's this connection, so it works this way in the web. And I'm making the big weaving hand gestures, which everyone's going to see on the podcast. It's great radio.
It happens.
Meaning is how we make our lives make sense. It's how we make our understanding of our relationship to the rest of the world and all the people in it make sense. It's not exactly the same thing as narrative. It's not exactly the same thing as definition because I think it has a more visceral, more emotional component to it than just definition.
Right.
But, and I told you that so I can tell you this.
Okay.
We have different experiences. Two people of the same faith with the same background who went to college together or whatnot, sitting next to each other in the same pew, in the same circle, whatever, of the same ritual, have slightly different experiences of that. Based on how they're feeling, based on what particular biases they're bringing to it all. And they can individually go their separate ways and come up with unique individual meanings for that experience, which is great. And it works fine in a lot of people, especially people who are not fortunate enough to live in a major metro where you can't swing a dead cat without hitting 3 pagans.
Right.
Have to do that a lot. But to make that meaning together, to share those experiences and discuss them and find a way to make that meaning for those experiences that is strong and important to the individual, but also helps link the individual to the group of people who are seeking that experience, those experiences together, is what religion is all about.
Yeah.
If you're going to distinguish religion from spirituality, the spirituality in my mind is the individual pursuit of those experiences and coming to understand what they mean for you.
Right.
Religion is the group pursuit of those experiences and coming to what it means to us to have them. So 2 people, I think, can have wildly different experiences of the same thing, but come to a similar meaning by working together to help keep the lines of their lives woven together.
Yeah, I mean, I one example of that, and I spoke about this in the interview with my mom that I did previously, is, when we were sitting vigil with my great aunt, it was a great mix of people. There's my mom, the agnostic, my dad, the whatever, there's me, the big old pagan girl, and, my uncle, the fundamentalist, and then my other uncle and my aunt, who are the Catholics, And while we all experienced the moment of her passing differently, like, I saw the goddess, my mom just felt a sense of peace, and she felt spirit in the room, and my dad really hasn't talked about it with me, I guess. But, and my uncle and my aunts felt something different. The feeling of resolution, of peace, that she was in a better place, that she was with the other people in our family that had passed on. Right. That was all common to us, even though we saw something completely different and experienced it completely different.
And in terms of maintaining that feeling of being a family together, the making of meaning of those experiences together is important in terms of what is that for me personally, and what does it mean to me personally, that is also important. And they can be the same thing and they can be different things. And, maybe it's, my own Southern upbringing with the church ladies bringing casseroles and the whole thing. Right. I think it would be a shame to fall only into one or only into the other. And I think that's where some of the divide in the community is coming from, is individuals feeling like they're being forced to choose between one or the other. Yeah. And maybe not recognizing themselves in a community, that it might be different from them. Right. I went back. My dad died a few years ago, and I went back to Kentucky for the funeral. Right. Like I said, I was raised Southern Baptist, and my cousin was the minister for the funeral. And he had a good low-key preacher vibe going. But I tell you, I heard the name Jesus more than I heard my dad's name, and it got to the point where after sitting there for 30 minutes or so of it, I thought we were burying Jesus. Right. And I found that hard to connect with. Yeah. All right? Right. But, I realized that was me finding that hard to connect with. But what I did feel was the presence of my gods with me in that moment. And being able to bring my personal meaning internally got me through that experience of what has become a very alien web of meaning and image and experience. Right. And there were people there who were obviously having some kind of deeply spiritual experience. Their grief was being transformed into presence. And that was what allowed them to feel their grief very deeply. And what allowed me to feel my grief was the feeling that, I'm feeling separate from this, but I've got my spiritual peeps around me helping me deal with this.
And sharing grief and community.
Yeah. And that was the thing. Relating to the humans there as humans kept me in the community. Relating to the gods who had come with me allowed me to do the spiritual processing. And the two had to run in parallel because it was just such a different religious set.
Right.
But it can be done, and it can be meaningful. But too many times I think people who are worried about whether or not their experience is true or their experience is right will try to deny or exclude other people's individual personal meanings.
Right.
In an attempt to reinforce their idea of their God being the only God, or the way they see, the way they understand we should deal with death being the only way to deal with death, or whatever it is.
Right.
And it's, again, that everybody playing to their own insecurities pushes that divide farther apart.
Right.
And there's just got to be a way to take people of very different, very diverse backgrounds and bring them together in a way that they can participate in the community as a community of humans.
Right.
Even if it doesn't feel to them as a community of spirits.
Right.
One of the things that I go to a lot of heathen events. Well, a lot for my personal, rarely able to get myself out of the house definitions of a lot. But I go to a lot of heathen events. And when I go, I introduce myself as, hi, I'm the ambassador from the South. And make it clear that I am there not as a heathen, because I'm not a heathen. I'm heathen adjacent. I'm heathen friendly. Freya has been knocking on the back of my head and going, we got stuff we should talk about. But that's a personal relationship with Freya as an individual spirit, not a taking on of that religious culture. And it's important to me that I be clear. I'm a Dionysian polytheist. I'm here because I like y'all and because I like your gods, and we can work together even if I'm not one of you. But at the same time, I am one of them in being there. I don't identify as heathen. I don't do the same practices except when I'm doing it with my friends who are heathen. So there's a level to which I am there and one of them as a human being doing the work of pursuing experience of spirit and turning that into meaning.
Right.
So yeah, I am one of them in the sense of being a human being engaged in the pursuit of experience of the spiritual, engaged in the pursuit of creating a common religious meaning for our lives and for that spirit experience.
Right.
But I'm not one of them in that I'm doing it differently in some ways. I'm using a different set of symbols to help generate that meaning. I mean, a lot of the actual practices are the same. You know, they both heathens drink a lot of booze religiously. I'm a devotee of the god of wine.
Right.
So there's a lot of booze being poured and drunk at either devotional.
Right.
You know, and there are mystics and spirit workers and whatnot among heathens. And while I don't think I'm quite a spirit worker, I am something of a mystic, even if a poor one.
Yeah.
So we can relate on that level. So there's certain parallels. But when it comes down to plugging into what does this mean our gods want for us in our community, that's where it starts to diverge a little. And that's okay, because we have those other levels on which we are still connected.
Right. And
I guess I'm saying I don't want to be in a community where disagreements over the high levels of meaning making of how does this relate to our particular gods and our particular community become divisive on the other levels of being together as humans experiencing the same pursuit.
Well, I think to some degree, you know, there's needs to be a modicum of respect. You know, you need to respect that if you're going into somebody else's space, you know, doing like you were saying, you know, you go in and you introduce yourself to say who you are, or just being respectful of the space itself, even if you don't get the chance to really talk about who you are, what you're doing there, what, you know, going on to the long explanation of who you are, you know, just being able to be respectful of the space. So, you know I try to do that when I go to different rituals or even churches or anything like that, you know, I try to be respectful of the space, kind of like seeing what's going on, trying to do, you know, just follow along and doing what I can to be present and present with spirit, but not intrusive.
Right. A friend of mine, in a discussion we were talking about interfaith work, defined interfaith work as a kind of hospitality. And I think one of the things that can be more deeply explored to great benefit is the idea of sacred hospitality.
Yeah.
When we invite the gods into our homes, we are good hosts to our guests. So that when we are out in the wide world, in their domain, they will be good hosts to us. When I am a guest at someone else's ritual, I will be a good guest at that ritual. It doesn't mean that I have to pretend that I'm them. It means I have to respect what they're doing. I have to respect them enough to engage with what I can and pull back from what I can't.
Right.
And when I am hosting an event, I regularly host an event that is primarily a devotion to Dionysus, which draws people who are not devoted to Dionysus. It has drawn Christians. It has drawn atheists. Who are there for the human engagement aspect of it. But I have never had a problem with someone on a religious level because I try and make it clear at the very beginning that this is the hospitality I am offering. This is what I am doing. I don't ask that you believe in your heart as I believe, but participate in goodwill and harmony.
Yeah.
And the idea of hospitality being a sacred obligation, as sacred as any prayer or ritual or altar work or whatnot. Understanding that that means how you receive the stranger. Understanding that that means that you treat even people you don't like well while they are your guest, because it's a sacred relationship. Whether you like that individual or not, they are your guest. And as the sacred guest, you will treat them as a sacred person. The idea that we can be host and guest to each other without having to be the same would heal a lot of this rift, I think.
Absolutely. And it's a radical notion. It's something, you know, I've explained that to people and they're just kind of like, whoa, you know, I didn't really see it that way. I've never really thought of it that way. And I think that comes back around to what we were saying earlier, is being honest about what you're doing and saying, you know, this is the ritual. This is what we're doing for the community as a public ritual. And, you know, this is what's going to happen in this ritual. This, you know, these are the deities we're talking to.
Right.
And, you know, everybody's welcome to come if this is something that's interesting to you.
Right. And moreover, if it's not something you're wanting to do, don't come and be uncomfortable and make it harder for the people who do want to do it.
Yeah. Or, you know, even if it's not your cup of tea, if you're wanting to learn, you know, you're welcome to come and learn. Which
is part of being the good guest, knowing why you're there and what you're there for and being upfront about it. We've been using the word honest about this, and I think it's the wrong word.
Yeah.
Because I think most of the people who are putting out rituals and assuming that they are all inclusive and all welcoming when they're actually not, aren't being dishonest. They're not trying to deceive anyone. They're just so steeped in their own idea of whatever it is that they don't see how someone from outside it would look.
Right.
So I think maybe something that combines transparency and awareness of diversity, if there's a word for that, would be better than honest. Because we're not saying don't lie to people, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure most people have run into places where somebody actually did kind of bend the truth in order to get on the program or whatnot and then went some other way.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we've certainly seen that in community.
Yeah. But that's not what we're really talking about most of the time. What we're talking about most of the time is people being unaware of what their assumptions are and how their assumptions shape the way they treat their guests.
Right.
So a greater awareness and a greater transparency probably works better than honesty when we're talking about that. To be more transparent about what's going to happen at your ritual, to have more awareness of how what you are doing shapes shapes experiences to predispose for some things and make other things not so easy to do.
Right.
You know, that is something that is important for anybody who's going to be doing public anything, whether it's a large dinner party or a large ritual or whatever. But it's something that gets lost because people tend to assume the stuff they do in their living room just scales up to the thing they're going to do in the ballroom at Pantheacon.
Right.
And it really doesn't.
Yeah, and and sometimes you don't understand that until you do the scale up. It's kind of like, I used to work in biotech, and there's things that you could do in a small test tube that when you scale up to liter, kiloliter levels, it all goes boom.
Right. And to bring it back around to the pagans, polytheists ongoing debate, there are a whole lot of people, because what they do in their private spiritual lives is based more or less on Wicca, with different stuff thrown in and out. The basic ritual tech is Wiccan, and it works for them. And all the people they know feel the same way about it. If you're one of the all gods are really facets of the great goddess people, and the 6 people you work with all have the same thing, and you all hang out with people who all feel the same thing.
Right.
You try and take that into a larger group, you're going to run into people for whom that doesn't work. And if you're not aware that that is your perspective on the experience, and other people's perspectives may be different, and those differences are equally valid, back to awareness of diversity, there is going to be a misfit. There is going to be rough edges casting sparks when you say that your ritual is for all and open to all, and you're not aware that you're actually trying to create a very specific experience, which may not be what somebody else wants, and may not be what somebody else can have. And the dissonance of trying to have the spiritual experience they're used to,
right,
while you're trying to do a different experience for them, is just gonna cause problems unless we are aware of these differences and willing to say, sorry, I fucked up when I said that. I said it was for all, but I didn't realize that there were a lot of people for whom it wouldn't fit. I'll try and be better about that next time.
Yeah.
Which is what a lot of these things come down to. A lot of the people who are no longer identifying as pagan, but identifying exclusively as polytheist, have run up against not just the experience didn't fit what I was thinking, but when I tried to talk to people about it, I was shouted down. I was told that I'm just being disruptive. I was told that I'm wrong about the gods because everybody else, the person running the ritual reports what they already know.
Right.
And that's the pulling away. And the same thing happens with gender and ritual.
Yeah.
If I recall, at least one of the small explosion that happened before the big explosion a few years ago.
Right.
Happened because people weren't transparent about the process and the requirements for the ritual, and handled them poorly when it started to cause small problems.
Right.
And from what I've been seeing, at least most of those people have figured out how to do that better now. And that was cool. It was very divisive at the time, and it was very painful on all sides at the time.
Right.
But it's been a few years. We've worked on it, and a lot of the people who were involved on either side, and thank you and Sarah for spearheading some of that.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Have, by working together openly with an awareness of differences of experience and differences of desired effects, manage to smooth that out again. And there's no reason that we can't have the same kinds of successes, the same levels of successes, dealing with people who have different theologies. There's no reason we cannot create a common ritual experience that allows for people of different theologies and different varieties of experience and depths of experience to come together and be a community. Yeah. Without requiring that one person be right and one person be wrong.
Well, one of my mentors at City of Refuge, she's awesome. And, one of the things that she said to me a long time ago that was really stuck in my brain is that even the margins have margins. And that, we're willing to say, there's like concentric circles, and like, so I'm now in this set of circles, and we'll just keep pushing people out, and they're not good enough, or they're doing it wrong, or and I think one of the things that you said that's really important is accepting the difference,
right,
and being and being okay with the difference. I mean, not to the detriment of safety, but if we're just talking competing theologies, like you're a polytheist, you're a Wiccan, you're Santeria, you're just competing theologies, then accepting that they're all going to be different,
right,
and then that if we're all in one room doing something, we can accept the identity of the ritual itself, and yet still allow for everybody's difference.
One of the things that has to be changed, I think, cognitively overall, is even very well-meaning people mistake words like true and right for being universals when they're not. They're relationals.
Yeah.
True as compared to what? Right in what context?
Exactly. And that's a universal thing, of any spiritual path, tradition, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. And there has to be a place where people can look at other people's traditions, even if their traditions are 180 degrees away from my own. Even if the experiences they are seeking are not the same kinds of experiences I'm seeking. Seeing that as a, cool, we're very different. Maybe we shouldn't party together. Or if we do come together as part of a larger community, we should try and set those aside for the moment. But that setting aside doesn't have to have any bearing on the truth or rightness of anyone's experience in anyone's life.
Absolutely.
My grandmother was the Sunday school teacher at the Southern Baptist Church my family went to from the time I was born to the time I was 9 or 10.
Right.
My grandfather was a deacon in the church. When I got married years ago, and that didn't work out, but that was years ago, and everything's going kind of smoothly now. When I got married, it was in an overtly pagan ceremony in a Unitarian Universalist church with my little Southern Baptist grandmother. Came up after the ritual bringing the family Bible. And I don't know if everybody listening knows what a family Bible is, but in some cultures, not necessarily some religious traditions, but in some cultures there is the family Bible, which is the one where everybody's phone number is written down in, where the dates for all the births and deaths and marriages and whatnot are written down in.
Right.
And she brought the family Bible up to me to make sure she had the names right when she put them in there. And there are not words for how much that meant to me. Even though we had been standing up there in garlands and talking about goddess and god and elements and whatnot, things entirely outside what she believes, what she understands, being willing to reach out as family and saying, you are still family and I still love you, and you are still important enough to me to be included in this record of our family. Despite the differences, despite the huge gulf theologically and practice-wise. It's a shame we can't do that more often. It's a shame we can't do that with people we've just met.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it is a shame that, we're not able to sometimes see past our own theology, our own ideas, to do that.
We become so afraid that difference will be disruptive in a way that we cannot handle, that we can't look past the differences to see the similarities. I think that as paganism grows, it's going to become a more diverse community with less of a theological center.
Yeah.
There are a lot of people who find this threatening.
Absolutely.
I
know some of them.
Reading the millions of pixels that have died horrible deaths in the flame wars.
Right?
Over whether or not polytheism is right, or whether or not, some version of monism is right or whatnot.
Oh, let's not don't get me started, because, whole Christo-pagan thing, oh my God.
Yeah, the same thing. So much of that is about people saying, the way you do things doesn't work for me. I'm going to do things my way. Mm-hmm. And someone reacting to that with, but I spent my entire life making the world safe for the way I do things. Mm-hmm. How dare you say we need to do it differently now? Right. People who came up through the 70s and the 80s, very different era of paganism, very different experience of it, who had to fight very hard to get enough people together to feel like they actually had a community.
Right.
See this growing and more obvious diversity as a threat to that sense of having a solid community. Mm-hmm. And part of what that community was based on was the common experience of the divine made meaningful in a similar way through a similar religious culture. And if we are going to maintain a cohesive, any kind of meaningful idea, any kind of meaningful meaning to the term pagan community, we can't define it as we all believe this one thing. Because even when most people who were commenting seemed comfortable with the definition of we all believe this one thing, it wasn't true then either. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We just didn't talk about the ways it wasn't true in public.
Right.
Now that the community is so big that those differences are important, as they are as important as the similarities, we need to find a way to embrace those. We need to find a way to be a community that respects the difference within ourselves instead of doing this whole, we're pagans and we believe this and we're different from the overculture kind of thing. And our belief in this defines us as different from the people who have cast us out of the mainstream.
Right.
I don't know that paganism will ever be mainstream, but I hope it becomes large enough that it can be a community of diversity. Theologically as well as racially, as well as age rate, as well as, age cohorts and whatnot.
Right.
The focus of the community will be on the community rather than the focus on whether or not you're praying right.
I hope so. And with that, we're out of time. So thank you so much for being on the show.
Well, thank you.
And if people would like to get in touch with you, how can they?
Well, the place where I blog is yodionysus.wordpress.com. That's IODIONYSOS.wordpress.com.
Yeah, and we'll have that in the show notes.
Right. And failing that, you can find me on LO as Lon Sarver, or on Facebook as Lon Sarver, or Uncle Dark, most places in the web.
Right.
Or you can just email lonsarver@gmail, and it'll get to me.
Well, we'll list all that in the show notes, and that way if people want to talk to you, they can. And if there's any comments on the post, I'll forward them to you too.
All right, thank you.
All right, thanks, Lon.
I'd like to thank Lon for joining us this week, and as always, if you have comments, questions, or would like to read the show notes, you can go to thisweekinheresy.com. There you can also subscribe to the show via iTunes or the Stitcher app, join our forums, or follow us on Twitter at TWIH Podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.